The Trumpet Daily with Stephen Flurry.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. We're off and running on another week of broadcasting. I'm freshly shaven, although as I look at the monitor, I could use a haircut, so some more grooming to be done as the week unfolds. On today's show, we had some pretty good response to the Bible study segments last week, particularly the segment or the point that we made about being persistent in our requests to God. So we'll continue along the lines of that particular point in our study today. Coming up on today's show as well, we'll be going through some sound bites from Bill Barr's dynamite speech that he gave on the Constitution and the radical left. Quite a few of his enemies responded immediately to some of his statements, calling for his impeachment. You come out and criticize the left, and they want you out. He's a big target, and he's also someone that my father's written a fair bit about this past year, going back even to the memo that he wrote in June of 2018, and how that really did expose the great flaw in the Mueller investigation, particularly with respect to obstruction of justice. So we'll get to that a little bit later as well. A couple weeks ago, we had a program on the worldwide surge of protests, particularly in the month of October, and that has continued. These same protests have continued on into November. In the case of Hong Kong, in particular, we see widespread protests across that region. You can see some of the footage of that and hear some of the sound in the background. But in the New York Times, this is talking about what happened there over the weekend. The clashes were the culmination of the most disruptive week of the months-long protests, a period that has focused a global spotlight on the growing desperation of the pro-democracy activists and aggressive efforts by the police to suppress them. This video, by the way, is compiled by the New York Times as well. It says it's a sign the conflict is turning more violent as the territory prepares to hold elections later this month. This says the activists are struggling against the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. And so it's a struggle between freedom seekers and communism, the Communist Party. And it talks about some of the history we wrote about in the Trumpet magazine back in the 1990s. The British or the UK handing Hong Kong over to China, and it was supposed to have, I guess, 50 years of freedom, and we're just 20-some years on from that. And you see those freedoms being taken away. It says a small number of supporters of the Communist Party rule, as well as this chief editor at the Global Times, are so outraged by the protesting that they're calling on the government to use live fire instead of rubber bullets. And it says, finally, the clashes of the past week began when protesters changed from a regular routine of weekend protests to disrupting traffic on workdays. And this most recent incident has revolved around universities, some of the protesters seeking refuge in the university environment. So it does seem to be escalating. It's gone on now for, I guess, 6 months in Hong Kong. And over this same weekend, just this past few days, there were mass protests in Iran as well. On Friday, the government there announced that it was going to be raising gasoline prices by 50%, as well as rationing it. So there's some indications here, once again, that President Trump's sanctions are playing a role in some of this turmoil, at least in Iran. Now, Iran has lots of oil, but the sanctions have made it hard for Iran to refine that oil into gasoline and to get spare parts for its oil infrastructure and such. And so these, whatever all the causes are, this hike in gasoline prices has enraged a lot of the citizenry. And the government, of course, just like in Hong Kong, they're clamping down on these reports of unrest. One person, I think, was killed on Friday, a couple more on Saturday. There have been, of course, as these things happen, as you see with Hong Kong, there's pictures or video that stream all over the internet, and the government in Iran has responded by shutting down the internet just to keep this from spreading. That gives you a pretty good indication of just how worried they are about another uprising. Forbes had this to say: even for a country as restricted as Iran, the material limitations on the information accessible from inside its borders, this is extreme. This is extreme. The actions that the government here is taking. NetBlocks called the government or the internet shutdown the most severe recorded in Iran since President Rouhani came to power. So as I say, it indicates just how worried this government is, the mullahs, how worried they are with respect to the this general uprising among the people. But going back to that program we had a few weeks ago about this trend, really, it's all over the world. You can list them off, as PJ Media did recently: Lebanon, Chile, Spain, Iraq, Sudan, Russia, Uganda, Peru, Hong Kong, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The world is on fire. And listen to this sobering conclusion at this piece at PJ Media. It says the media are missing the biggest story since the fall of the Soviet Union. Something strange is upending the world. Something strange is happening here, says PJ Media. Something strange is causing the world to be upended. And of course, the point that PJ Media makes is just that the media are missing this. And that's true. I mean, that is certainly true. But there's a bigger point to be made about that statement. Something strange is upending this world. Something strange indeed. There is a real spirit world. Satan the devil is the god of this world. 2 Corinthians 4:4. He's deceived the whole world. And he's the prince of the power of the air, it says in Ephesians 2. He's surcharging the air with his attitudes, with his spirit of rebellion and violence and insurrection and insubordination. He's the spirit behind the so-called resistance. He's the spirit behind the corruption, the gross immorality. And speaking of that, the headlines all across the UK since Saturday night have to do with Prince Andrew's interview with the BBC. And he's obviously faced a lot of criticism in recent months because of his friendship with the late sex trafficker, Jeffrey Epstein. He visited Epstein multiple times, stayed with him, even after Epstein was convicted. I forget when that was, several years ago. But even after the conviction, he maintained a relationship with him. And now he gives this interview, Prince Andrew, and the media here in the UK, they're calling this one of the biggest disasters for the royal family in decades. It goes from bad to worse for this royal family presiding around the old throne, the old stone. Well, they don't even have the old stone, do they? That's up in Scotland. This is Prince Andrew. She's the Queen's second son, so the younger brother of Prince Charles. The brother of the soon-to-be king, presumably. The Telegraph described this interview. I'll play a clip here in just a moment. But it described the interview as excruciating, extraordinary, a car crash. The Times said Prince Andrew's broadcast equivocations were an embarrassment and a disgrace, and the monarchy stands mired in scandal as a result. The Financial Times said this is one of the royal family's worst TV interviews ever, worse than those of Prince Charles talking about the collapse of his marriage with Princess Diana. As I say, it goes from bad to worse. The Daily Express had a headline today: Royal crisis, Queen has lost control of Buckingham Palace, according to royal insiders. Now, a lot of the criticism aimed at Prince Andrew is over his apparent lack of empathy for the victims, all of these victims of this sex trafficking scheme. And then he was asked in this interview Saturday night if he regretted being friends with Epstein, and you can listen to this exchange, clip 14.
Do you regret the whole friendship with Epstein?
Now, still not, and the reason being is that the people that I met and the opportunities that I was given to learn, either by him or because of him, were actually very useful.
Well, there you have it. He learned a lot from this pedophile. That's not a really good look for the royal family here in Britain. As I say, throughout the interview, he didn't really talk much or have much to say about the victims, didn't seem to express much sympathy. And then even the explanations that he's given about his behavior, his bizarre behavior, they just, there's a lot of people that are shaking their head. The excuse of, well, I went to see Epstein, even after the conviction, in order to tell him that that I'm ending the friendship. So he goes to New York and he stays with him for a few days, and they're seen walking at Central Park. It doesn't add up. One commentator in the Telegraph, he said, Prince Andrew's appearance on Newsnight was a turning point in British history. Royals have given interviews before and about intimate matters, but they always enjoyed some degree of control and displayed some basic sense that people were watching. This felt more like a police interview. Well, what did my father say in the New Throne of David book? He talked about what God has given to his church in the early part of 2017, how that royal family was displaced as the royal family of David's throne. And then you look at all that's happened to that family, even since January of 2017. My father wrote about the royal family's rapid decline since that revelation given to God's church. And as I say, you look at what's happened since. William and Harry and all of the celebrities and so on. The reality show, as we've talked about before. And then the split between William and Harry, or at least Harry talking about the two of them for now anyway, being on different paths. The controversy over Meghan Markle. The two of them, Harry and Markle, lecturing the British public about the environment, even as they jet set around the world. That's something that hasn't been very well received. And then now this turning point in British history, according to the Telegraph. I think another side note that you could attach to this story is why at least there was a reporter who was trying to get to the bottom of it. Now a lot of people in and around the royal family have said that it was dumb for him to agree to this interview, but at least there's a reporter trying to get to the truth. We played that clip for you a few weeks ago. The ABC reporter, remember, that said they had the Epstein revelation 3 years ago. They had it in 2016. But that story was squashed. They're not going to release it in 2016, not when it could hurt Hillary Clinton. But I see clips from this interview on Saturday night and think, where are the reporters in going after another close friend of Jeffrey Epstein? And that would be Bill Clinton. He's untouchable. The Clinton family, untouchable. In fact, Richard was telling me the first 15 minutes of this BBC presentation, you have the interview for 45 minutes, but the way the BBC sets it up for the first 15 is, okay, there's Prince Andrew, he had this association, and then they refer to others that were associated with Epstein, Alan Dershowitz, and then Donald Trump, and Bill Clinton's nowhere to be found. Bill Clinton traveled the world with him, visited with him many times, multiple times. And yet there's one snapshot at some public gathering with Donald Trump, and that's what BBC, that's the takeaway that they want for you to have. one wonders why there aren't a few more reporters in the United States who are curious about Mr. Clinton's relationship with the late Jeffrey Epstein. Well, over the weekend, there was quite a bit more commentary on the ongoing impeachment saga. Marie Yovanovitch's testimony on Friday. And during her, whatever it was, 4 or 5 hours, she sang a sad song about how she was mistreated. She's been a professional diplomat for decades. And then there was the smear campaign, and she doesn't know why Rudy Giuliani and Sean Hannity would ever question her political motives. Why they would smear her. And there was one congressman who said because she was fired and she was doing a great job, this is an obvious abuse of power for President Trump to come in there and say, you know what, I'd rather have a different ambassador. There's a story at the Daily Caller about Barack Obama before even the inauguration in 2009. He was in the transition period in 2008, and he sent a note out to every ambassador appointed by George W. Bush that they were going to be turning in their resignation, or in other words, fired from their posts the day of the inauguration. Every single one of them. And the media, of course, they didn't think anything of it. They reported it back then in a positive light. This is wonderful. This is the Washington Post from 2008. The incoming Obama administration has notified all politically appointed ambassadors that they must vacate their posts as of January 20th, the day Barack Obama takes his oath of office. The clean slate, it says, will open up prime opportunities for President-elect to reward political supporters with posts in London, Paris, Tokyo, and so on. And then listen to this. Political ambassadors, this is the Washington Post take back in 2008. Political ambassadors sometimes are permitted to stay on briefly during a new administration, but the sweeping nature of the directive suggests that Obama has little interest in retaining any of Bush's ambassadorial appointees. No interest at all in retaining any of them. He just fired them all, Barack Obama did. And nobody impeached him. Nobody suggested impeaching him. Certainly, not that I know of, nobody said this was an abuse of power. This was pretty much normal. Well, on that Friday hearing, besides revealing or trying to show that she was mistreated, she revealed that the State Department, when she was appointed by Barack Obama back in, I think, August of 2016, or that's when she came into her position as ambassador at Ukraine. And before her confirmation vote, it was revealed on Friday that the State Department, Obama's State Department, prepped her for the confirmation by telling her how to respond to questions about Hunter Biden should they come up. As was noted in an exchange on Friday, the Obama State Department had their concerns about Hunter Biden and his connection to Burisma and the fact that Joe Biden, then sitting vice president of the United States, was basically given charge of Obama's foreign policy with respect to Ukraine. Here's what you need to say. If a senator asks about this apparent conflict of interest, this is how you can respond to it. So the State Department knew those two individuals last week on Wednesday that were interviewed or testified, Kent in particular, he expressed his concern for Hunter Biden's position. And then Yovanovitch essentially did on Friday as well. Let me take you to one key exchange between Yovanovitch and Republican, I think, Chris Stewart from Utah. This is clip 16.
I would now feel compelled to ask you, Madam Ambassador, as you sit here before us, very simply and directly, do you have any information regarding the President of the United States accepting any bribes?
No.
Do you have any information regarding any criminal activity that the President of the United States has been involved with at all?
No.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that directly. The American people know this is nonsense. The American people know this is unfair.
It's just a bunch of nonsense, as he said. No bribes. She has no evidence that he accepted bribes or that he was engaged in any criminal activity. But President Trump fired her, just like Obama fired every ambassador appointed by the Bush administration. And then she wasn't even there, as many have pointed out. I don't need to go through the facts, but she wasn't even around when the phone call in question was made. She was around, however, back when Ukraine was working to undermine the Trump campaign in 2016. She was there in her post. There's an exchange. I don't think I'll take the time to play it. I'm already running short on time. But Jim Jordan, he had an exchange with her on Friday as well, where he said, look, they were trying to influence the election here in the U.S. The DNC was sending one of its operatives to the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. Ukraine was trying to take out Paul Manafort, suggesting that they were investigating him, and that actually did lead to Manafort's resignation in 2016. I mean, they were having a real impact on the presidential election. And Jim Jordan asked her Friday, did you do anything as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine? Did you do anything to stop it? Did you pick up the phone and say, hey, cut it out? You're supposed to be neutral. You can't just side with Hillary. And she answered Friday. She said, no, I didn't do anything. So the way the left is trying to say that this is, well, she was just a neutral bystander and she didn't take sides is not the truth at all. Not at all. President Trump and Giuliani and quite a few others have a very different take. This woman was deep into the deep state. She was an extension of Barack Obama's thinking. She was pro-Hillary and very much against Donald Trump coming into office. I don't even know who all. I think one of the key witnesses going this week will be on Wednesday, so maybe we can come back to some of the impeachment nonsense in a few days. In any event, I want to leave some time here for William Barr's speech, his dynamite speech on Friday at the Federalist Society. This, I think, could be a harbinger of things to come. I mentioned on Friday's show this meeting that Mr. Barr had with the president, Thursday afternoon, I think it was, and then Friday he's giving this speech, and of course we're probably days away from the Horowitz report, the IG report, being released. I saw a story earlier today that this might be one reason that the Democrats are rushing through this impeachment hearing, or these hearings, so that they can hopefully reach a conclusion and have a vote before the IG report comes out, because it's going to be so condemning. And there probably are going to be quite a few criminal referrals together with this report. So here comes the Attorney General in front of this large group of conservative lawyers, and he really assails the radical left. In listening to this speech Saturday night, it was hard for me to wrap my mind around the fact that William Barr is in the same position or office that was just recently held by Loretta Lynch, Eric Holder. What a change in direction. That's what my father's talked about in comparing Antiochus with Jeroboam. What a change in direction for the United States. Let me just remind you what my father said in the August 2019 Trumpet. This is the article, Can President Trump Get Control of His Own Divided Government? It says, since Donald Trump became president, a dangerous level of corruption has been exposed in America's federal government. Officials within several powerful government agencies have worked actively to sabotage Mr. Trump and overturn the results of the 2016 election. They have worked to sabotage this administration. Then he says this is treasonous behavior and a bigger threat to America than most people realize. Now, it's one thing for you to be able to read that at the trumpet.com or at the Trumpet magazine, but to hear essentially the same thing coming from the Attorney General of the United States. Well, listen to this. This is from that speech on Friday, clip 1.
Immediately after President Trump won election, opponents inaugurated what they called the resistance. And they rallied around an explicit strategy of using every tool and maneuver to sabotage the functioning of the executive branch and his administration. Now, resistance is the language used to describe insurgency against rule imposed by an occupying military power. It obviously connotes that the government is not legitimate. This is a very dangerous and indeed incendiary notion to import into the politics of a democratic republic. What it means is that instead of viewing themselves as the loyal opposition, as opposing parties have done in this country for over 200 years, they essentially see themselves as engaged in a war to cripple by any means necessary a duly elected government.
That's William Barr on Friday, using even the same word in one case, sabotage, as the August trumpet. This is an insurgency, a coup, a war, as he said there at the end, against a government that, as the left sees it, is not legitimate. This is why, as some of the Republicans have pointed out, this is why you have 5 Democrats sitting on that Intel committee conducting these impeachment hearings. 5 of the Democrats voted to impeach this president before the July 25th phone call even happened. It's just like one headline from last week. You're guilty. Now let's go ahead and have the trial. He's guilty. He's already guilty. It doesn't matter what he said or didn't say on the phone with the president of Ukraine. He's guilty. Now they just have to have the show trial. They have to try to find, and that's why they keep changing. Quid pro quo. Well, no, how about bribery? And then Friday, oh, now you're going after witnesses. You're trying to intimidate witnesses. That's impeachable too, the media said. And so the Democrats hopped right on board with that. What will it be today? They're trying to find the impeachable offenses as they go. It's just like the Mueller investigation. He's guilty. We know he's a Russian agent. Now let's go find the evidence. Listen to what Attorney General Barr said again on Friday, clip 2.
One of the ironies of today is that those who oppose this president constantly accuse this administration of shredding constitutional norms and waging a war on the rule of law. Of course, there is no substance to these claims. When I ask my friends on the other side, what exactly are you referring to? I usually get vacuous stares and sputtering about the travel ban or some such thing. The fact is that, yes, while the president has certainly thrown out the traditional Beltway playbook and punctilio, he was upfront about what he was going to do, and the people decided they wanted him to serve as president. But what I'm talking about now are fundamental constitutional precepts. And the fact is that this administration's policy actions and its policy initiatives, including the travel ban, have transgressed neither constitutional nor traditional norms and have been amply supported by the law and patiently litigated through the courts to vindication.
That's William Barr on Friday, talking about, of course, the president did come in with a different playbook. He campaigned on that. He was upfront about it, and that's what the people voted for. So if you look at, again, Republicans have tried to bring this out in the impeachment hearings. Just because the president has a different view of how things should go with respect to foreign policy in Ukraine, for example, that doesn't mean you impeach him. That doesn't mean you kick him out because he happens to disagree with the State Department, or he opens up a back channel group with Giuliani or whoever else. He's the president. He is the executive branch. And whether you agree with what he does or not, he has the authority, as Mr. Barr brought out in that speech on Friday. He has the authority to establish policy. And as he brought out at the end of that last clip, what he's doing is not unconstitutional, these actions that he's taking. Here's the real explosive statement, the one that had so many Democrats and never Trumpers saying that, well, now we need to impeach William Barr. Clip 3.
The fact of the matter is that in waging a scorched earth, no-holds-barred war of resistance against this administration, it is the left that is engaged in the systematic shredding of norms and undermining the rule of law.
Now go back and read that article that I mentioned. Can Donald Trump get control of his own divided government? And my father says that Bible prophecy says that, well, in the short term, he will. He will get control, more control than he has now. And a lot of it is because of this man that you just heard, the Attorney General, who says that it's the left, it's the radical left, that is shredding the norms and undermining the rule of law. Now, over the weekend, this was at some campaign in front of top Democratic donors. Listen to what Barack Obama, the previous president, listen to what he had to say about the left's agenda and how they need to go about imposing this agenda on the United States. The sound is not as great as some of these other clips, but I think you can make it out just fine. Clip 10.
Even as we push the envelope and we are bold in our vision, we also have to be rooted in reality and the fact that voters, including Democratic voters and certainly persuadable independents or even moderate Republicans, are not driven by the same views that are reflected on certain, left-leaning Twitter feeds, or the activist wing of our party. This is still a country that is less revolutionary than it is interested in improvement. They like seeing things improve, but the average American doesn't think that we have to completely tear down the system and remake it. And I think it's important for us not to lose sight of that.
Listen to that comment there. What he's saying to these Democratic donors that, look, there's some far left comments in this presidential campaign, and you better be careful because this is still a country, he says. This is still a country. Now, hopefully it won't be this way all the way through, but right now, as of this moment, it's still a country that's less revolutionary than it is interested in improvement. They like seeing things improved. But the average American doesn't think that we have to completely tear down the system and remake it. That's what the average radical leftist revolutionary thinks, that we've got to tear down the system and remake it. So you better be subtle. You better not be completely forthright when you're out there campaigning in this presidential election season. You've got to kind of sneak in. And then you can go about fundamentally transforming the United States of America. And that's what he set out to do. In 2008, my father says in the article I mentioned earlier, when Barack Obama became president, he said that he wanted to fundamentally transform America. He succeeded on a dangerous scale. The damage his administration did to this country is immeasurable. It's immeasurable, the damage that has been done. And you get a different administration in there and a different attorney general, and now we're seeing the level of corruption, the lawlessness on such a wide scale. Go back and look at our other booklet, He Was Right, the chapter on the communist infiltration of America, and see what Satan's been up to the last 40, 50, 60 years. One more clip here from Attorney General Barr on Friday, clip 4.
In any age, the so-called progressives treat politics as a religion. Their holy mission is to use the coercive power of the state to remake man and society in their own image according to an abstract ideal of perfection. Whatever means they use are therefore justified because, by definition, they are virtuous people pursuing a deific end. They are willing to use any means necessary to gain momentary advantage in achieving their end, regardless of the collateral consequences and the systemic implications. They never ask whether the action they take could be justified as a general rule of conduct equally applicable to all sides. What would we think if the shoe were on the other foot? And yet we hear them irresponsibly tabling proposals to do away with the Electoral College or to pack the courts. Who's shredding constitutional norms?
That's William Barr on Friday. Who is it? Who is it that's really shredding constitutional norms? Listen to what Stacey Abrams had to say. She's a Democrat that ran for governor in Georgia, I believe it was, last year. She said this over the weekend, clip 11.
Electoral College is racist and classist. We have to remember the Electoral College was not designed because people were worried about Idaho not having enough votes. We didn't know about Idaho. What we did know, we didn't.
That's Stacey Abrams. She lost the election in 2018 by tens of thousands of votes. She refused to concede to her opponent. She said that he stole the election. And the media, you'll remember, I forget how many weeks it was. The media was out there trying to get this story out there. Yeah, that's right. The election was stolen from her. And here's this woman saying that the Electoral College in the Constitution is racist and classist. Who's shredding the Constitution? William Barr asks. My father in the article, Can President Trump Get Control of His Own Divided Government? He says, those people were getting control of the government. Justice in the land was destroyed. Rule of law was twisted and perverted. People were losing faith in the government. He said, if this trend had continued, it would have meant the end of our republic. Who can deny this statement now? Looking at the level of corruption, as I say. Looking at what's being exposed. Looking at these deep state bureaucrats that were halfway around the world, basically conducting policy the way they thought it should be conducted. Never mind what any president has to say. Certainly not Donald Trump. My father says, but God was not ready for that. He was going to save America. However, this would only be temporary. Only temporary. This quote I paraphrased earlier. Biblical prophecy indicates that there will be something of a turnaround, though, and that President Trump will actually gain more control of these government agencies that have been working to unseat him. And then my father goes into the section on William Barr and the fact that he was, he only stepped into office, I think, February 14th. President Trump nominated him December 7th, less than a year ago. And then the hearings for him, January 15th and 16th, all these interesting dates. And now he's been in office for what? Just a few months. I played the one speech from a few weeks ago on this program a week or two back. And then now this one. My father writes, Barr loves the Constitution, and he understands it as few men do. During his confirmation hearing, he said he reveres the law. It's been a long time since America has had someone like this in the Department of Justice. It's refreshing, my father says, to have someone praise and uphold the law at a time like this. This should be uncontroversial, but in a way, it has challenged the whole government structure in Washington. That's what my father wrote in August. And now look at what more is being revealed as a result of this impeachment, this circus. The more and more they try to take out Donald Trump, the more and more you see what was going on in Ukraine this year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago during the election, the U.S. election, back in 2014, with Ukraine's so-called revolution. I think it was Richard who said he joked on the Trumpet Hour Friday that he's been trying to get people interested in Ukraine for 10 years. But this is what it takes to get a mostly American audience to actually look into it. The more layers you peel away, the more corruption you see. The deep state, it goes deep. Well, we've got more clips from Mr. Barr's speech, but they are on a slightly different subject, so maybe we can reserve that for tomorrow's program so that we can save a little bit of time today to finish off the show with a short Bible study. We'll be right back.
This is KPCG-FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily. Freedom is one of the most sought-after ideals in human history. Man's search for freedom has taken him into the fiercest of protests, struggles, revolutions, civil wars, and even world wars. Today, in the midst of free societies, many continue to fight for what they perceive as ever greater freedoms. And yet, many of these same people are actively fighting against law. Few people understand that this war against law actually undermines true freedom. To learn more, request Gerald Flurry's booklet, No Freedom Without Law. In this free booklet, you will see what the Bible says about the latter-day spirit of rebellion and lawlessness that is now so common in our nations today. Also request America Under Attack. In this booklet, you will learn more about the spirit behind this attack on law. You'll see where this is leading. Both booklets are offered freely at no cost or obligation to you. Request No Freedom Without Law and America Under Attack. Email your request to td@kpcg.fm or visit thetrumpet.com. From the Philadelphia Church of God campus in Edstone, England, this is the Trumpet Daily program with Stephen Flurry.
On Friday's show, I went through a passage in Luke 18 about the persistent widow, this parable that teaches us how that we ought to always pray. We ought to always make our requests known to God. This is the parable of this widow that goes before this judge, and the judge finally said, after her persistent requests over and over again, he finally says, though I fear not God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. She just continually went and made this request. And Jesus said that the lesson for this, or the lesson for us in this, is that we ought not to faint. Or as the Revised Standard says, we shouldn't lose heart. Look at what it says in Matthew 24. Familiar verses over here. Jesus speaks about false prophets rising up and deceiving many. And then he says, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. We've seen this happen in the Laodicean era of God's church. The love of God's people waxing cold. Waxing cold. And then verse 13 says, but he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. That word endure, if you look at Strong's, it means to remain, to bear, to have fortitude, to persevere. He that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. Thayer's lexicon, it says to persevere absolutely and emphatically under misfortunes and trials, to hold fast to one's faith, to endure, bear bravely and calmly, absolutely, ill treatment. You push your way right on through. Even when you're coming under a relentless assault. There's some lessons we can take away from what's even happening in the news. Just a barrage of attacks. And yet you see some examples, some few examples, not nearly enough, but some few of individuals that will stand up to it and face it every day and go forward. We've seen examples in history, as I've noted on this program. Winston Churchill. Look at the assault he came under in the 1930s, or following the Dardanelles disaster in 1915. He just kept bouncing back. He never let it bury him. He just pressed ahead. Matthew 10 and verse 22, it says, and you shall be hated for all men, or rather hated of all men, for my name's sake, but he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. See, we've got to endure trial and affliction. We've got to finish the race that we're in. We have to persevere, as Mr. Armstrong says in the 7 Laws of Success. He writes, yes, 9 and 10, at least once or twice in a lifetime, come to the place where they appear to be totally defeated. All is lost, apparently that is. They give up and quit. When just a little more determined hanging on, just a little more faith and perseverance, just a little more stick-to-itiveness would have turned apparent certain failure into glorious success. Glorious success is there for those who persevere to the end, for those who endure to the end. In the autobiography, Mr. Armstrong tells the story of this man who anointed Mrs. Armstrong. And Mr. Armstrong, you can read this in the autobiography, he was reluctant to let this man pray over his wife at first. But the man assured him that, look, what I am going to do is straight out of the Bible. This is how I do it. This is the prayer that I'll offer or whatever. And so he went ahead and let this man anoint his wife, and Mrs. Armstrong was healed almost immediately. And it was some years after that healing that God revealed a new truth to Mr. Armstrong. It had to do with the day of Christ's resurrection and the Sabbath versus Sunday observance. And so after writing up this truth in article form, Mr. Armstrong immediately thought of this man who had anointed his wife. He viewed him as a great man of God. a man of faith, a man who believed in the healing promises. So he thought, well, boy, I've got this exciting new truth. If anyone would receive it well, it would be this man. So he went and presented it to him, and that man then took it to his pastor, who told him that studying into those subjects, it was dangerous. It was dangerous. And so that's what he conveyed to Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong was really disappointed. He thought, well, why don't you just look into it for yourself? Why take the word of this pastor? What I've presented here is straight from the Bible. Well, a week or two later, this man ran up to Mr. Armstrong on the street and kind of frantically told him that God had left him, that God was no longer answering his prayers. Mr. Armstrong knew why straight away. He knew why that man was not having his prayers answered anymore. He rejected God's knowledge. He rejected God's truth. He didn't act on the truth of God. He didn't do something. Here's what Mr. Armstrong says. God had used him to bring to us a truth. We accepted it and began to walk in it. Then God used me, it says, to take him a truth. God used me to present him with new revelation. He acknowledged that it was the truth. He had seen it proved, yet he rejected it and walked in disobedience instead of in the light. God used this man no more, it says. Of course, he had much to learn. Had he continued as an instrument in God's hands, true Christians must continually overcome and grow in grace and in the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Listen to this. He says, the servant of God cannot stand still. Either he advances and grows spiritually against opposition and obstacles, or he falls by the wayside to be rejected. It's not an easy road. It's not an easy road following Christ. It's not an easy road to obey God. It says this incident just described is but one of many of its kind. Later I was to encounter many more whom God used to help me in his work, only to see them endure but a while and fall aside. He just saw this all through his life. People who came along and were excited initially, maybe they went along for a few steps in this way, this more excellent way, as Paul said. But then for whatever reason, maybe they grew weary in well-doing, maybe they got tripped up by a weakness, or just attacked from the devil. Maybe it was a sore trial, or just, as we read earlier, just a loss of love because of spiritual lethargy. It says here, several of these have been among our closest and most loved personal friends. These experiences have provided our greatest suffering in God's service. They were pictured by Jesus' parable of the sower and the seed. And then he says here, it seems the majority, think about this is in the autobiography written decades ago, and then think about what has happened since the death of Herbert Armstrong. A massive falling away, the great falling away from the truth. It says, it seems the majority who start out on this straight and narrow road of opposition, persecution, trial and test, self-restraint, continuous attitude of repentance, overcoming, growing, fail, it says. A majority fail to endure to the end. In so many ways, this race that we're in, this spiritual race that you're in, that I'm in, it is a test of endurance. Will you continue in this race all the way through to the end? This is what we sign up for when we count the cost. And we say, okay, I know what God's expecting of me. And I know that if things go bad in a month or two or a year, or if I struggle with this, or I'm attacked over here, or I trip up from this weakness, I've got to get up and keep going. I've got to keep running. It's a test of endurance, obeying God. It's a test of endurance, supporting God's work. It's a test of endurance, living the way of love all the way through to the end. Enduring to the end. It's going to take some persistence on our part, some perseverance, some stick-to-itiveness. Tomorrow, when we come back to this study, we'll see from Paul's writings where he says this is a race that we're in. It's like a marathon. And above all, the goal, the objective here is to finish. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. If you'd like to email the program, you can send feedback to td@kpcg.fm. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you tomorrow.